So we're in the book of Matthew, and we're kind of like on the way out. What we're going to do is we're going to continue through the book of Matthew until the last week of Jesus' life, and then we're going to push pause until we actually get to the last week of Jesus' life in the spring. And we're going to do some other things until then. But we've been in the book of Matthew for a while. And the book of Matthew it's one of the four gospels. It's one of the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They all have very similar writing, very similar stories. And then John's a little bit different. And in the Matthew, what we're looking at is Jesus' life and ministry. And what he starts with is he starts by announcing the kingdom of heaven. And then he teaches about the kingdom of heaven, says it's very different. It's this upside down kingdom. It's not what you think. It's not the way of the world. It's very different. And then he comes down the mountain and he begins to bring the kingdom of heaven into people's lives. And he encounters different reactions to the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is the Messiah. He's announcing himself as the Messiah or the anointed king, the one who is going to bring about his own kingdom. And he's not the Messiah that people have thought. He's very different than what they expected, what some people hope for. For some people, he's way better. For some people, they're not really sure about it. And for some people, they're actively against him and his kingdom. And as he encounters these people, he begins to teach. And he begins to act and react. And we see him going up north to Caesarea Philippi and do this incredible thing, allowing Peter to announce him as the Messiah, to begin to put his flag in the ground at the gates of hell, saying, hey, the gates of hell, they're not going to prevail against my kingdom and my way. And then he goes up to the Mount of Transfiguration. He's transfigured before Peter, John, and James, and Moses and Elijah show up, and the Father speaks. It's this big, epic moment. And he comes down from this mountain and he encounters a demon-possessed person. He encounters the resistance of the enemy. He encounters the spiritual resistance that you think, obviously, yes, he's going to encounter. And then as he goes further, he heads towards Jerusalem. Now we're in the section of Matthew where he is heading towards Jerusalem. He's heading towards his death. He's heading towards the moment of all of humanity, where he will take death upon himself, sin upon himself, and he will defeat death and rise from the grave. And as he does this, he continues to tell people, to remind them, I'm not the Messiah that you think I am. I'm not the conquering king that you think. Yes, I will conquer, but I will conquer in a very different way. Not through violence, not through force, but through taking all of humanity's violence upon myself on the cross. By taking all of your sin, all of your corruption upon myself and suffering and dying. And although he announces it over and over and over, and although he continues to teach about the kingdom, the disciples don't get it. And what we find, and we'll see it today in a question that they ask, is they have a fundamental misunderstanding about who Jesus is. And thus, a fundamental misunderstanding about what the kingdom of heaven is like and what it looks like to be a citizen of that kingdom, to be a participant in that kingdom and an expander of that kingdom. And so let's go ahead and jump into the book of Matthew, chapter 18, verse 1. And it begins this section where Jesus teaches them about what the community of faith looks like when we're all broken, and oftentimes we don't get it, and we mess up, and we hurt each other. What do we do? How do we function together in that world? Now, I know that we can't, in our church, relate to that because all of us are good and we're perfect and we're all kind and compassionate. We all love each other. We all serve one another. We all look at each other as more important than ourselves. And we don't fight. We don't divide on anything political. So you're just going to have to imagine. So we just kind of imagine for a second a community that actually isn't like ours. You know, can you imagine that? I know all of you grew up in perfect families where you don't fight. There's no sibling rivalries. You know, fathers never, go too far in their discipline, and kids never go too far. You know, we're all perfect kids, right? So just imagine, maybe you've seen it in a TV show. Maybe some of your friends, some of those other people, they fight in families. You can imagine it just for a second, right? So maybe some of you have a friend who has a family it's difficult. The kids don't get along. Kids and parents don't get along. They fight. Okay, you're all there. So Jesus is going to talk about those people out there, those people that are different from us. And so just imagine yourself there. Now here's what happens. It says this, Matthew 18 verse 1. It says, at that time, the disciples, so this is Jesus' followers, his disciples, probably about, 15 to 20 people who are his disciples. You've got the 12, and then you've got some other people that were traveling along with him. So at that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Now, before we judge them, which we're going to do here in a second, but before we judge them, let's relate to them for a second. Okay, I don't know about you, but I long to be great. I do. I always have. In any pursuit that I've gone after, there's been some part of me, and hopefully over time it's shrunk, but some part of me that just wanted to be great, wanted to be admired, wanted to be looked at and loved, wanted to be applauded, wanted people to respect me, to think highly of me. I've always wanted to be great. I've wanted to do great things. I think about the shows growing up that I loved and why I loved them so much. Right now, Hercules comes to mind, the most underrated Disney movie of all times, Hercules, right? But it's about, this kid that grows up and he's awkward and he doesn't really fit in and everyone makes fun of him, they exclude him, but he knows that he's destined for great things. And he sings a song, I've often dreamed of a far off place where a great warm welcome will be waiting for me, where the crowds will cheer when they see my face. I've never seen it before. I've heard about it, but I've never seen it. I don't love this movie, but I do. But can you relate to that? Wanting to be great, desiring to be great, wanting to be important, and trying to figure out throughout your life, what do I need to do to be great? What do I need to do to be admired, to be loved, to be accepted, to be respected? And we try and figure it out as we work through our lives and we stop doing the things that don't work and we start doing the things that do work. I remember early on I tried to be a superhero and I dressed up in tights with my underwear outside my tights and my cape flapping in the wind, and I got mocked for that. That didn't work, so I changed. I tried to be a great basketball player, and that would give me love and acceptance. That would make me valuable and worthwhile, and it didn't work. And so I tried to be a musician, and I wanted to get applause, and I wanted to sign autographs. I wanted people to love me. And you've probably never heard of the great Brady White, the musician, because it didn't work. And I just think about my longing and desire for greatness, and I can relate to these disciples. On top of that, you think about what Jesus has been talking about. First of all, he plants his flag right in the middle of the enemy's territory, this bold statement, and then what he begins to tell the disciples over and over and over again is, I'm going to suffer and die. I'm going to suffer and die. I'm going to suffer and die. And so you can imagine his followers who realize his movement is an important movement and somebody's got to carry the torch. Right? Somebody has to take over after Jesus is gone. If he's going to suffer and die, who's the greatest? Who's going to carry on his mission? Who is the most valuable? Who has the highest status? Who's going to continue your work, Jesus, when you die, when you leave? This is an important question that they're asking. And you can see their minds, their confusion. Jesus declared Peter the rock, but then he called him Satan. Then Jesus took 3 guys, Peter, James, and John, up onto this mountain of transfiguration, this special moment, and the rest didn't. And there's this wondering, who's the greatest? Who's the greatest? And the Greek word is megas. Who's the biggest? Who's the most important? It's a word connected with status. Who has the highest status? Who has, superior importance among us? Now, here's what I love about this question. This question is not just a question, but it's a question that reveals what's going on in their heart and their mind. Nobody asks this question unless you think you know the answer. You in a group of people, you don't just totally volunteer, hey, who's the best one of us? Who's the best at this sport? Who's the best at this, trivia? Who's the best looking? Who's the most popular? You don't ask this question unless you think you know the answer and you think the answer is you, right? You definitely don't ask this question to Jesus and you think he's going to say you. And yes, you think there's a really good chance that you are the greatest. Otherwise, he's going to say somebody else and you're going to look really foolish, right? You're going to feel really sheepish, aren't you? Which is okay because we're all sheep. in Jesus as pastor. But still, you're going to feel really foolish. And so you know that when they ask this question, they all think they're the one. They all think they're the greatest, they're the most important, they're the most valuable. They all think they're the one that's going to carry the torch, carry the flag, carry the baton when Jesus leaves. And so here's what Jesus does, and I love it. It's incredible. He always does this. It's brilliant. Here's how Jesus responds. Chapter 18, verse 2. And calling a child to him. So he doesn't answer the question. He looks around. He's like, there's a kid. Hey, would you come up here for a second? He calls a child to him. And he put him in the midst of them. And he said, truly, I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. I love this. First thing Jesus does, he just sidesteps the question and doesn't answer the question. Who's the greatest? He looks around, finds a kid, puts him in the middle of them and says, unless you turn and become like this kid, you're never even going to enter into the kingdom of heaven. He doesn't answer their question. He sidesteps it because he sees what their question reveals about their heart and their mind, and he says, this is an opportunity to teach. This is a teachable moment. This is an opportunity to disciple. This is an opportunity to bring them into maturity, to give them some clarity. Jesus is always teaching, he's always discipling, he's always mentoring. It's like he's walking along just waiting for a moment to help them into deeper maturity, to help them into deeper clarity about who he is, about what the kingdom is like, and he does it right here. And so he uses this visual. He gets a child and puts them in their midst. Now, what does he mean by a child? So their question is about greatness. It's about status. It's about importance. So really what Jesus does is he looks around and he finds, at least according to their society, who is the least important person they could imagine. So I'm guessing he's thinking, okay, in the minds of the disciples, who is the person that is definitely not the answer to their question? Right? They're wondering who's the greatest. So he's like, who in their mind is the least important person? Who is the person that they think there's no way Jesus would say? Who is the person according to society that has the least value, the least importance, the least power, the least ability? And it would have been a kid. In that day and age, a kid would have had the least amount of status. And so he's like, there's a kid, come up here. And he brings this person who has no status according to the law, no status according to the way that they think, no ability, no wealth, no power. And he puts this person and says, this is what you need to become like. He says, unless you are turned, meaning your question has demonstrated what your life in following me has been about. So this is towards the end of Jesus' ministry. They've been following him for about 2.5 years. And it reveals that through this 2.5 years, although Jesus has been teaching the upside down kingdom, even in following him, they haven't got it. They've missed it. They followed him and tried to accumulate status, tried to accumulate power in their own group, tried to become the greatest in their own group. And Jesus is like, you don't get it. You're heading the wrong way. The way of accumulation of status, accumulation of, power, of admiration, respect in this way of trying to be the greatest, it's heading in the wrong direction. So you need to now turn, unless you all who are asking me this question, unless you turn and then become like this child, this person of low status, this person of low power, of low strength, of low wealth, of low ability. Unless you turn, you won't ever even get into the kingdom of heaven. See, they're thinking about the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and Jesus says, in order even to enter, in order even to get into, you have to turn and become like children. You have to abandon your quest for status. This is an upside down kingdom. It's not the way of the world. It's the way of humility, of sacrifice and service. That is the kingdom of heaven. That's the love that Jesus demonstrates. And just so we don't get off on the wrong foot, this is not about justification by merit. See, what humility is humility is the abandonment of merit. Merit is earning something. It's saying that I have something that I have done that earns favor. but turning and becoming like a child, turning and becoming someone of low status, or viewing yourself, I guess, rightly, in that we have no status before God. We have nothing to boast about before God. It's abandoning that view that I can merit it, that I can earn it, that I've done something of value, that God says, oh, because you did that, Brady. Oh, because you were that way. Oh, because you treated that person that way, or you served, you gave, or you fill in the blank. Thank you for doing that. You have earned your way into my good graces. And Jesus is saying, no. The entrance into the kingdom of heaven is humility, the abandonment of status, the abandonment of merit. Realizing our poverty before God, our spiritual and righteous poverty before God, and pleading for his grace by faith. Entrance into God's kingdom is a gift. And when we realize that gift, we know that we have nothing to boast about before God. Unless you turn, unless you repent and become like a child, you will never even enter the kingdom of heaven. And then Jesus says this, verse 4, whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. This word humble, this Greek word tapinoo, it means to physically lower yourself, to forsake privilege or status, to take on the attitude or mindset of a person with low status, or to subject yourself to strict discipline. You kind of get the picture of what Jesus is saying, that you need to turn, and it's going to be a difficult turning from your pride, turning from what you feel like you've earned, turning from what you feel like you've worked for. It's going to be hard. It's going to be difficult. And what Jesus begins to do here is paint a picture of the underlying attitude, the underlying mindset or lens that they're looking through that causes all kinds of problems in their community. And even over the next couple weeks, what we'll look at is, what does it look like to live in a community of people that are striving for greatness and status, who view themselves as better than other people, who look down upon other people. What does it look like to live in this broken community? And how do we forgive and reconcile? How do we live together? What do we do in this way? And Jesus begins with this huge key, that there's an underlying attitude of pride that gets in the way. And if we would continually repent from our ways of pride and humble ourselves, looking at the other person as better than ourselves, it will radically change the way that we interact with one another. Now, Jesus takes this and he begins to turn the conversation towards the community. And he says this, whoever receives one such child. So now he's not talking about this person, this child anymore, this person who's not old, right? He says earlier, unless you turn and become like this child. So now he says one such child, like one such person who has turned. So he's now talking about all of his followers. He says, whoever receives one such child, one of my followers, in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones, and you're beginning to hear echoes of things that Jesus has already said about his followers, so you know this is what he's talking about, and we'll see it later on in the context. Whoever causes one of these little ones to believe in me to sin, who believes in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone. This would have been a gigantic, heavy rock, a millstone fastened around his neck, and to be drowned in the depths of the sea. First thing he says is beautiful. If you receive one of my followers, one of these little ones, who has abandoned status and followed after me in humility, if you receive one of them, you receive me. Which, what a beautiful promise. What an incredible truth, that when we invite in, when we love, when we care for, when we serve, when we sacrifice for fellow followers of Jesus, fellow sisters and brothers in Christ, we are receiving Jesus into our hearts, into our homes, into our communities. What a beautiful thing that we can do when we care for one another, when we love one another, when we serve one another. We are loving Jesus. We are serving Jesus. We are caring for Jesus. I love this. But then he begins to paint a very heavy, weighty picture. But if you if we cause someone else, another follower of Jesus, to sin, to stumble. This is the word scandalizo, which basically we get the word scandalize. If we cause someone to be scandalized, to have a great downfall, to turn away from Jesus, it's better that we all go get a big old millstone, tied around our neck, and be drowned in the depths of the sea. Like, whoa. That doesn't sound like just the loving, kind, Jesus is my homeboy, picture that we have in the Bible oftentimes, right? The way that we have in our society that we paint of Jesus that isn't a full picture of Jesus. Jesus is serious about what pride will cause in the community and what that chain reaction will cause and how that will taint the gospel. Jesus says, take this seriously. Your pride that causes others to turn away from Jesus is a big deal. It matters. It matters. It's a big deal. He goes on to paint this picture and even more serious notes. Matthew chapter 18, verse 7, he says, woe to the world for temptations to sin. For it is necessary that temptations come, meaning like, it's going to happen. In this world, temptations are going to come. In a world where humans have the ability to choose either to follow God or not, there's going to be sin, there's going to be temptations, there's going to be brokenness. It started in the Garden of Eden. But woe to the one by whom temptations come. He pronounces this woe on those who not only are affected by sin, but then participate in it and bring it to the community. And he says, and if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. Yikes. That's a big deal. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than with 2 hands or 2 feet and be thrown into the eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it's better you to enter life with 1 eye than with 2 eyes and be thrown into the hell of fire. Let's close in prayer. First of all, Jesus is using very big, exaggerated imagery to get your attention. He wants you to know this is serious, this is weighty. He is not recommending that we actually cut off our hand or our foot or tear out our eye, because Jesus, in other places, has rooted sin not in my hand that steals, not in my eye that sees, but in my mind and in my heart. And so really, if we're going to get at the root of sin, we have to cut out our brain and cut out our heart. That's what we have to do. That we need a complete and utter heart transplant, which brings us back to the gospel that we can't do and Jesus wants to do in us and for us by his grace as a gift. But he wants to let us know this is super serious. And he uses this imagery that is frequent throughout the Hebrew scriptures, particularly in the book of Proverbs. But 3 things: an eye, a hand, and a foot. And if you'll look through the book of Proverbs, you'll see this pattern throughout. The eye denotes, in the mind of Jewish people, my worldview, my outlook, the way that I see the world, the way that I see myself, the way that I see others, the way that I see God. It's my outlook, it's my worldview, it's my perspective. My hand would be an example of what I do based on my outlook, based on my worldview. And then my foot would be the path that I carve as I continue to live in accordance with the worldview that I have. So it's basically the person that you become over time, the habits that become ingrained in your heart and your mind as you continue to act in a certain way. Basically, Jesus is saying is we are continually being formed and shaped into a certain person, into a certain type of person. And it starts with our mind, with our heart, with our worldview, the way that we see the world. And as we act on that and continue to act and continue to act and continue to act, we become a certain type of person. We become a certain type of person. And he says, this is a big deal. And he says, it hurts you. Your sin, it doesn't just hurt other people, it hurts you. It damages you. It damages your own soul. It damages your own mind. It damages your own body. When you sin, you are hurt, not just other people, but you are. And it's worth it to take drastic measures to get rid of it. And it takes drastic measures. When you think about the sin that's in our hearts and our minds that have been developed over time, over a lifetime, sometimes it takes therapy. Sometimes it takes accountability. Sometimes it takes a community of people helping you walk into freedom. Any of you that have experienced any sort of addiction at all to any type of sin, you know how difficult it is to try and change. It's hard, and when you do, as you try and change, it feels like you're cutting off your hand. The first time you say no to, think about different addictions. Think about being addicted to cigarettes. I know a number of people, friends, that experience that type of addiction. I remember them trying to quit over and over and over and over again. And the first time trying to say no to a cigarette, it's like cutting off your hand. It hurts. In the same way, whatever sort of addiction to sin you experience, it hurts. And it takes drastic measures, but Jesus says it is worth it, whatever you do to get rid of the patterns of sin that lead you into a lifestyle of sin that form you into a person who sins, it's worth it. And then he uses this imagery of hell. Now, in the scriptures, in the New Testament, when Jesus says hell, and we see that in the English, there are a few different Greek words that are translated into hell. When he talked about the gates of hell, that was the word Hades. But here he uses the word Gehenna. And when we only see the word hell, it really flattens out what Jesus is doing, and we miss a lot of it. And what Jesus is saying here by using Gehenna, it's a very vivid image that helps us understand what he's talking about. Now, Gehenna is not a Greek word. It's a Hebrew word that they just use Greek letters to spell. And Gehenna it's from the Hebrew Gai Henna. Gai means valley. Henna is a certain valley. And it's a valley at the foot of Jerusalem. There are these two valleys that help make Jerusalem into this high mountain that make it, a great city to live in the ancient times, to be protected. And one of the valleys was the Kidron Valley, which Jesus would cross to go to the Mountain of Olives. And the other is the Valley of Hinnom. And in the Valley of Hinnom, the history behind this, it's pretty bleak. So there was a king, Manasseh, who was the son of the great king Hezekiah, one of the greatest kings in all of Israel's history. He had this son, Manasseh, who took over after him, and Manasseh completely and utterly rejected God and his ways. He began to worship other gods, and one of the gods he worshiped was Molech. And Molech was the god of the underworld, the god of the dead. And the way that you worshiped Molech is you would build these altars where you would sacrifice babies. Because Molech was, in their thought and mind, was fed by the blood and the bones of infants. And so what Manasseh did in this city that was the city of God amongst the people of God is he introduced child sacrifice. And he built these altars in the Valley of Hinnom. And they would, in the Valley of Hinnom, at the foot of Jerusalem, they would sacrifice babies to worship this god, this pagan deity, Molech. And what God says in the book of Jeremiah, you can look at it, Jeremiah chapter 19, he says, what you have done is you have lit the fires of Hinnom. You, in your sin, in your rebellion, you are the ones, you people, by sacrificing these babies in these fires, on these altars, you have lit the fires of Hinnom. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to allow Babylon to come in to destroy you, and all of those killed by Babylon will be thrown into the Valley of Hinnom, and they will be burned in the fires that you lit. This is the history of Hinnom. Now get this, in the way that Jesus is talking about this, what he's saying is that hell is not simply a future reality. It is a present reality that you begin to create for yourself by your own sin, by your own rebellion, by hurting yourself and other people. He said, right now, here and now, as you sin, as you engage in sin and participate in sinful behavior, you will experience some of hell here and now that you light for your own self. The consequences of sin, the natural byproducts of sin, is death. That you experience some sort of death here and now. And if any of you have ever been to the depths of addiction, you know what I'm talking about. It begins to destroy you and corrupt you. It begins to ruin your life and your family and your relationships. And what Jesus says here is you need to know that the fires of hell here and now are lit by your own choices. That sometimes God allows you to experience the natural byproducts of what you have chosen to do. So do whatever drastic measures it takes to get rid of it out of your life. He goes on in verse 10, he says, see that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father. This word despise is to look down upon with contempt. When you look at people who are brothers and sisters in Christ, and you look at them as lesser than you, as less valuable than you, you begin to build this corruption. Your pride destroys the community. And he says, don't you understand? That person that you hate, that person that you despise, that person that you look down upon, do you understand how I feel about them? He says, I want you to know that my Father, they have an audience with my Father always. Their angels always see the face of my Father. That person that you hate, God loves. That person that you look down upon, God values and elevates into his presence. He says, you need to begin to think about people the way that I do, the way that my Father does. Even the person you hate, even the person that you've hurt, even the person that has hurt you, God values that person. In verse 12, he says, what do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountain and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than the 99 that never went astray. In the book of Luke, he uses this parable to talk about those who are lost. Here he talks about it as those who are part of your discipleship community that you've caused to go astray. And he says, here's the deal, and this is the beauty of Jesus. He takes this serious, weighty discussion that we need to take seriously and carry the responsibility. He says, but I want you to know that even when you fail, even when you hurt people, even when you cause them to sin and they go out, he says, I want you to know I'm searching for that person. And when I find them, I'm going to rejoice. That even when we hurt people, even when we cause division, Jesus is still working in the midst of all of that to bring about the beautiful reunification of the people into his family. That's the heart of our God. And then he says this, verse 14, so it is not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish. The heart of God is beautiful. When you think about all the sin that we indulge in, all the sin that we cultivate, all the sinful ways that we destroy relationships, what do we deserve? We deserve the hell of our own making here and now and in the future. We deserve to be eternally separated from God. We have stoked the fires with our sin, with our hurt, with our gossip, with our anger, with our bitterness, with our lust, with our greed, with our pride. Like we have done this. We have participated. All of us have. And yet, in spite of that, in spite of the seriousness of what we've done and what we continue to do, Jesus says, I'm continually searching for you to find you and to bring you back in. And it's not my will and it's not the Father's will that you should perish. And what I love about this is it's not just sentiment. It's not just, oh, God would rather you not. It's not just that it breaks God's heart when we sin and we hurt each other and we hurt ourselves. But Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem to give up his life, to take all of our sin, all of our filth, all of our rebellion, all of our lust, greed, pride, anger, all of it upon himself and pay the penalty for our sin. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Jesus says the one who humbles himself like this child is the greatest. Who's the one that truly humbled himself like that child? by forsaking his status of divinity, by setting aside his privileges of divinity and becoming a human servant, and becoming obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Jesus. Therefore, God has exalted him and given him the name above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow on heaven and on earth, and every tongue declare that he is Lord to the glory of God the Father. Jesus is the one who humbled himself and gave his life, giving us the ultimate example of how we should walk in his footsteps as his followers, to bring about the beauty and unity and love in his community, in his family. He is the greatest. He is the one that we worship. And we, by his grace, are invited into his family, and we, by his grace, are continually forgiven and brought into maturity. What an incredible God we serve.